So now let's begin. I would like to ask our first speaker to share his screen. Damien is Global Head of Sensory Client Managed Panels at MMR Research in the Netherlands, and he will share his sensory journeys with us. So Damien, the floor is yours.
Thank you. On a technical point of view, I think you have to stop sharing so I can share mine, actually. Yeah, here you go. Yeah. Let me see which screen I want to share. Okay. Tell me if you can see something. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So it's working. Nice. Well, hello, everybody. So thanks a lot for the few words of introduction. So I guess today, the plan is I will talk a little bit about myself in a minute, but just to set a little bit the scene for that presentation. So I was asked to basically share a bit of my own experience about being a sensory consumer scientist in a multicultural environment. Don't expect a lot of heavy scientific slides. It's really more about my own personal experience, anecdotes. I've tried to structure it in a way that makes sense, but it's really more about me sharing what happened in the past 15 years than trying to find a scientific point to it. So just to share a little bit more about myself. So as I said, I have 15 years of career in sensory consumer science. I'm originally from France. I've always worked in sensory positions in different companies. So I worked for major FMCG such as Mondelez, PepsiCo. I've also worked on the ingredient supplier side for Givaudan, Flavor House, Cargill more recently. And as you can see on the map, I've pointed the different places where I've worked. So I spent a bit of time in different countries in Europe. Started in France, moved to the UK, Ireland, and then
företag Mondelez, det är kraft.
Sorry, say that again?
Ingen aning.
No, you can continue. Yes.
Okay, no problem. And yeah, and I've spent a bit of time in Asia Pacific after. So I worked in Australia, in Melbourne and Brisbane. I've worked in India, a couple of years in Mumbai, and then I moved to Singapore before the past few years coming back to the Netherlands. So I've traveled a little bit thanks to my job mostly, which is one of the good things about being a sensory scientist, I guess. It opens up opportunities. Currently, I'm working for MMR, which some of you might know. It's one of the leading agencies for sensory and consumer testing. I'm based in the Netherlands, but looking after our, I'd say, global portfolio of clients for a thing we call client managed panel, which is basically where we come in a little bit as consultants to help various companies build their sensory capabilities and help them manage it also long term. So I work with clients around the world, managing the panel leaders, managing the panelists, and making sure they really get a good level of sensory data. So that's for me. As I said, I wanted to share a little bit about my experiences. So I've tried to put it in 3 pillars. So the things I learned about working in a multicultural environment, about sensory and consumer understanding, how it helped me also in terms of career, understanding the corporate world, and a little bit more about some personal experiences. So we'll start with really what I learned, and that was really helpful in my jobs as a sensory and consumer scientist. So the first thing is, it looks kind of obvious, but when you work in different countries, you really are confronted to the reality that consumers will perceive things very, very differently from place to place, and the cultural background plays an enormous amount of importance when you are designing a product or communicating about a product. When I was working for GSK in the UK, at the time, GSK still owned the Horlicks brand. So I was working on Horlicks, which for those who don't know, it's like a malted hot drink. And it's so funny because the same product, pretty much the same formulation, a few details, but was sold in the UK as something that was really geared towards like elderly kind of demographics to help you sleep at night. it was sold in India as a product for kids to help them get taller, stronger, sharper. So that really goes to show that when you deal with the consumer world, you really have to understand the market you're in. You have to understand what are the key things that can be interesting for the clients, because your product can be multifaceted and sold different ways. It also means that you have to be extremely careful about your preconceptions about product. One of the first project I worked on for Mondelez in India was actually something that, as a European consumer, would have shocked me. It's like you have this chocolate bar called Perk, which is basically advertised as having glucose energy. If you were in the Western world, I think you advertise something containing glucose, so basically sugar like that, it would get a big backlash, and all the health concern, everything would come back to, to make the product absolutely disliked by the consumers. But in India, actually, it was perceived as a good way to provide energy for the kid and sustain it during the day. Is it a right or wrong positioning? That's not my point right here. It just goes to show that you have to be mindful of that you cannot apply your own critical thinking based on just your personal experience to other cultures. There are really very obvious examples to show that you need to adapt strongly. Another thing that was very interesting to observe as a consumer scientist was how to organize fieldwork in different places. When we do multicultural studies, you will have sometimes the same set of products tested in different countries, but then how do you standardize the testing approach? Meaning, like, you do even central location test, can you really make it standard, or can you make it the same way everywhere? And country to country, you will have specificities. And here we are really far from science. It's really about practicalities, but you will have some countries where it can be self-administered test and things being done on laptops or tablets everywhere. Otherwise, the Wi-Fi is not going to allow you, or the strength of the internet connection is not going to allow you to do that. So you might have to revert back to paper. Is it self-administered questionnaire, or do you need sometimes people to go one-on-one to explain the questionnaire to the consumers? These are all things to take into consideration that you don't always think of when you start your career and you start planning projects in multiple countries, but they are very important. And the other part I learned also is be very careful with the standard of work, and always double check how the field works are happening. I had a very bad experience with one of the biggest consumer testing agencies who was doing some field work for us when we were when I was with Mondelez, and it was about tasting chocolate. And when we got to the central location test, the place where it was taking place, it was actually just a random house of one of the employees, and some consumers were coming to taste chocolate in the kitchen, others in the living room, some in the bedroom. Some chocolate was served at room temperature, Indian room temperature, so 36, 38 degrees. Others were coming straight from the fridge. I mean, it was a mess. It was a nightmare. So always pay attention to this. Otherwise, the data you're going to generate is pretty much void. One of the interesting things also about working through multiple culture and looking at what the studies show you, and when you start doing, compiling the work you do in different countries, you see that the assumption is that your trends preferences will really differ country to country. And I have a lot of colleagues in product development, marketing teams who came to me after projects in different countries asking me, okay, what is the preference of UK? What is the preference of Singapore on this product? And actually the outcome is that very often, unless it's a very strongly marked cultural product, meaning a product that's available in a country but not seen in others, if it's not a case like this, and if it's something that's widely available, actually, the variability within each country is, of course, very strong, and stronger than the variability between countries. And what you observe is that the trends and patterns within the consumer's preferences tend to be actually quite similar country to country. You tend to find the same groups of consumers. They are not explained by demographics. They are mostly explained by psychographics. Is it your consumers that are more adventurous, the ones that are a little bit more careful about health? Is it the consumers that want something to reassure them or to energize them? So having this lens of psychographics and trying to understand the needs and motivation of your consumers makes usually a lot more sense than trying to understand it through the lens of demographics, especially in a world that's quite globalized. I can tell you a lot of brands and shops are able to reach multiple markets. So you have a bit of a uniformization of the sensory trends globally. And the one last thing I wanted to point out also in that one is that as a sensory scientist, you will probably be asked at some point in your career to align sensory expert panels. This time I'm not talking consumer, but really pure sensory expert panels globally. It's a key challenge in many companies. And in principle, on the paper, I mean, sensory analysis is supposed to be objective. People can be trained. So you should be able to align panels. In reality, you will be always facing a lot of challenges. The panelists, depending on the countries where they are, will have had different exposure to different products. So they will have a very different background when it comes to food, beverage, or any other category of product, actually. So lexicon is not always possible to translate. You can have a word in a language that covers more like a concept that needs to be defined by 2 or 3 words in other countries. It's difficult to standardize the references and to maintain the alignment over time. So on that one, it's really always important to think about how you're going to tackle it in terms of sensory methods. Some methods are maybe a bit more adapted to alignment, things like a closer to spectrum approach with very strong references can be more adapted than a pure QDA approach. The handling of the lexicon and reference set is important. How far do you want the translation to go, and what freedom you give to be able to translate things into a way that's understandable by panelists in each country. Global language versus adapted language. Maybe there are some things you need to keep in your language globally, but some other things that can be more regional, and having strong alignment programs in place. These are all things that need to be taken into account in a case like that. And that was always a lot of fun in the various companies I was with to try to get to this alignment. So that was really for the pure sensory consumer side of things. Now, the fact that I moved from country to country and company to company also helped me in more like in a career point of view, but also understanding the corporate world. As I said, my experience was really a range from like quality, sensory quality, sensory in R&D, consumer science, or really product experience, consumer insights, even in some of my positions, so really more leaning towards the marketing side of things. And these are all very important at some point to learn skills that you might not get at uni. I mean, like things like communication, storytelling, influencing people internally or externally to your company. These are all things that are very interesting to develop and in multicultural context, I would say you learn very, very quickly on that one. So moving like I did, it really helped at the start of my career to accumulate experience fast, and also getting more responsibilities at an early stage. I think that got me to positions that I would probably not have that early if I had been staying in the same company in the same place. So that's one way. If you have the will to travel and that's also something personally you want to do, it's one way to also boost your career at the same time. We are lucky enough we are in a job that can be done anywhere in the world. It's our skills are really thought out by many corporations, so use that to your advantage as well. You also become corporate smart more quickly, and by that I mean that you see different models, you see different companies adapting a global model, a regional model, being more R&D led, being more marketing led. So you really adapt more quickly, and you're forced to basically be agile and work into different kinds of systems. So that's very interesting. And also it makes you aware of some corporate realities. And to give you an example, every company I've been with, I mean, there was always a divide between, for example, the US team or the rest of the world. Always one way to do things in the US, another way in the rest of the world. And that's not something you will change in many corporations. There are some markets that are very self-sustaining, such as China, for example. So will you ever have to align a China team with the rest of the world or the rest of APAC? That's another question. So you have a lot of things you learn like that working with different teams around the world. And also it gives you global exposure. You have the chance to live and to work in various countries. My personal point of view is that I've always enjoyed traveling along with developing my career, because that means I didn't just go on holidays for 2 or 3 weeks in a place, but I had time to settle, to live in different countries, and also to see the actual day-to-day challenges of people living there, not just passing through the country, but actually being integrated to a community on the spot. And you get to learn a lot from these experiences. I learned a lot also by running sensory trainings in various locations. Like when I was in Symposiums in Pepsi, for example, I was going from factory to factory, giving sensory trainings. And these are really wonderful experiences. And you get to create a lot of link and networking with a lot of people. And that's just very important, both at a personal and a professional point of view. And I think there is a real strength also in a multicultural team. So I can give you the example of our MMR office in the Netherlands at the moment. We have 11 or 12 people. It's kind of moving all the time. We are recruiting pretty actively these past few months. And I think within that team that's not massive, we already have like 7 nationalities. We have people from the UK, France, Belgium, we have Romania, we have Colombia. So it's really like a melting pot of different nationalities, which really helps, because also these people bring different backgrounds, different experiences. There are different stages of their careers, and they all bring their own network within the sensory and consumer world. So that is a fantastic place to be, because that means also any situation you're facing, any issue you might have, any challenge from a client, you will always find someone in the office who has either lived through that, done that, had some experience, and will be able to help you. So that's also the strength that having this multicultural experience brings to you. And on the last bit, so some things that are probably a little bit more personal, but also how these personal experiences can help you as a sensory and consumer scientist, and how you can translate it in something that helps with your jobs. Going into different countries, you have to learn about different cultures, and you have to become really more aware of everything that's happening around you. And I always give people this couple of examples that, so one is when I was in India, I basically invited a colleague. We are discussing cinema, and we are discussing about a movie that was being released. And at that moment, I told her, I mean, if you want, we can go and watch that movie during the weekend. And I could see the look of on her face, how shocked she was. And basically what I had not realized is that I was in a culture where, as a single man, you don't really invite a single woman straight away like that to watch a movie, just as friends. It's not really how it's totally interpreted. So that was a bit of, I say, cultural mistake from me on that one. And that translates also quite nicely in the way you will do consumer work. You always have to be aware of that. So similarly in India, when I was doing in-depth interviews, for example, whereas in other countries, I would have done maybe in-depth interviews with like teenagers, for example, on new chocolate development, I could have done it one-on-one. In India, it was better to do it by a group of 2 or 3 friends who could come and were more happy to talk in this kind of environment where they were feeling more safe, rather than having a one-on-one discussion with someone they didn't really know. So you really have to adapt to the country where you're at. And the second funny moment I wanted to tell you about was when I was in Singapore. So we did a bit of a team dinner in the office, and I don't know if all of you know what's on the picture, but it's called a raclette, basically. So which is a dish that originated from like the Switzerland-France border, and where you pour some hot melted, very smelly cheese on top of potatoes, cold cut, etc. And I was not sure my colleagues would really like it. In Singapore, you don't have very strong cheese culture, especially very smelly cheese. So, I was like, okay, that might work or not. And actually, it turned out they really loved the cheese, but hated this kind of savory, cold cut, very, very salty. And the second time we did it, instead of taking that, we took some very typical food from Singapore, which were more like a sweet kind of meat. And they loved the association between the cheese and the sweet meat. So again, it was just anecdotal. It was just me having a dinner with colleagues, but that goes to show that also when you are working in your own jobs, trying to develop new products, trying to understand the consumer, is to try to also do this kind of co-creation moment, trying to understand, okay, maybe some products might not totally work, but what are the components in the product that would work for consumers even in other countries? What are the ones that that would be a bit more problematic, and how we can replace things, how we can adapt it. So this is a very critical thing to do as a consumer scientist as well. And yeah, just wanted to finish to say that at some point, you know, the fact that you travel and you experience these kind of things, it helps you become a bit of a bridge between people. I had the chance to act a bit as a bridge between, for example, the Mondelez India team and the UK Australian team when I was living in India. I came there, I was the first expat in the research team, and I really helped bring together the teams from different parts of the world, and that was really a very good experience. I had some more anecdotal moments where I did some translation between Australian guy and Scottish guys who couldn't understand each other's accents. As a French, it's always fun to do that for English-speaking people. So yeah, so that's basically all the little things I wanted to share with you about this multicultural experience.
Thank you, Damien, for sharing your interesting journey with all of us. We can now open for question and answers. If anybody has a question from our audience in person here in the room or online, you can unmute your mic or type them in the chat. While we do that, I have a question for you. So you mentioned that you have worked in different countries with different teams, with different people from different cultural backgrounds. What has been the biggest roadblock and the biggest learning from working in such a multicultural environment for you?
Well, I think the biggest roadblock is always, it's yourself, basically. If you come to a country thinking you will come with your ideas and impose them, I mean, it seems obvious, but you have to be ready to adapt, to shift. And if you're not in that mindset of, you know, taking on what's happening around you and changing your own ways, then there's no point trying to settle somewhere else. You're just going to hit a wall. So it's really about personal point of view, personal expectations.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Yes, please.
Sorry, I have a question about you had on your list handling the lexicon.
Yeah.
And could you please elaborate a bit?
Okay. So when it comes to lexicon in the sensory world, of course, you have the attribute itself, the definition, and you should have a reference attached to it. The attribute and the definition are extremely misleading because there are words that can be misconstructed within the same culture, but also across culture. So what I've always tried to do is to make sure that the lexicon was attached to strong references and training mainly the sensory panels on these references. The definition, the attribute itself, the way you name it, in a way, I don't really care. It's more like for communication purpose after to how to interpret the data, share it with your product development, commercial teams. But what was critical to me is to make sure that the sensory panels were aligned, and that doesn't go through definition as detailed you want to be, you will always have misinterpretation. So for me, what was critical was always to have a good reference set attached to each attribute.
Thank you.
Any more questions from the audience?
What does the MMR do where you work right now?
I didn't quite hear that question.
So the question is, what does MMR do where you're working right now?
Okay, so we do a whole array of consumer sensory testing. So everything from sensory train panel to consumer qualitative work, quantitative work, concept testing, generation of video content, for example, if you want to share your insight in a bit more fun way than just PowerPoint. So that's what MMR has been doing for 30-something years, and it's a global agency. So we have offices in more than 13 different countries. So that's what we are specialized in.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Anybody online has a question? If you want to type them in the chat or unmute your mic. I think that's all about for the questions. If any of our audience would like to connect with you or ask you any questions after this workshop, can they connect with you? Do you want to leave your email or on LinkedIn maybe?
Yeah, more than happy to connect. You can find me on LinkedIn pretty easily. All the time on LinkedIn, so that's the best way to catch me.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
So with that, we are welcoming our next speaker, Carolin, who is a senior lecturer from Orebro University, Sweden. Carolin, the floor is yours. Do you want to share your screen?
Yes, I can do so. Welcome, and thanks for hosting me. And you see it?
It's coming up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks for inviting me here to your workshop today. And I was asked to talk a little bit about the supervision and communication parts and how cross-cultural differences impact supervision and teaching. And I'm going to focus quite much on the role of communication in that point, and how also different cultures and cultural backgrounds impact or influence rather the way we communicate usually and the way we communicate with others within and across cultures, and what the challenges and though also opportunities are associated with us. And so, as said, I am senior lecturer or now associate professor in political science at Orebro University in Sweden. I am a political scientist with a background also and a degree in international business studies. And I have been, I just want to move right now the slides. Is it moving for you? Yes, it is. Perfect. Yeah, and so I'm German from natively, and I grew up partially in Spain and lived then also in the UK and the US for a short time in the Czech Republic. And now, since almost 4.5 years, I have been living in Sweden. And so I have been trained in my personal life with, or not trained, but I have experienced a lot of cultural differences in my personal life so far, and then also in my work life. And so as said, I studied international business first, where I had some courses which taught me about how to do business in Asia or how to conduct business collaborations with companies in South America. And so I learned there many theoretical concepts, but at the same time, I also traveled and lived in different countries during that study periods as a student, but also doing some internships in, among other things, again, Spain and the US, UK. And in that experiences, then I also had some practical applications of the concepts that I had learned during the studies. And after finishing my international business degree, I started studying a master in political science in Germany, and also again moved abroad during the studies a few times and did there also my PhD. And after finishing my PhD, I moved to Sweden. And after or during the PhD and master in political science, I decided that I would like to stay in academia. And then in that part of in that job, I continued working in many different international projects. Is it moving for you? Probably not. No. Yes, perfect. So as part of my academic job, I have been involved, and I am involved in many different international projects, collaborating with people at universities in the US, with people in Brazil, in different Asian countries, among other things. Now I'm also going to Japan this year for a few months, and then I have been also involved and am involved in several projects with people all over Europe. Right now I'm also working in one project where we are 13 partners in 12 European countries, and it's a very vivid example of how enriching and challenging at the same time it can be to work with people from different backgrounds. And yeah, so this is a little bit an overview of my work experiences with interacting with people from other countries than where I come from. And I should also add that I'm not only doing research in my work, I'm also teaching and supervising students. So I have also been teaching students mainly from Germany and Sweden, since that's the two countries where I have been teaching, but also in those courses, and especially also in several international master programs that I have been involved. There have been students from different African countries, mainly Nigeria, Angola, and Ghana, but also from other places, and from Bangladesh and Iran, Iraq. And several of those students I have also been supervising as a master thesis supervisor. And they're, yeah, again, also different experiences came through have been making me more aware of what I'm going to talk about now on the next slides. So to first start with the opportunities that I want to highlight today, just also to have, so I should mention that many of those things, many of you might have also been living or are living currently abroad. And to some extent, we might implicitly already notice that there are sometimes some challenges or problems, communication errors when we communicate with someone from another country, but we don't really further reflect upon it. And just, try to continue and go on as we are used to, back from where we were raised. But over time, I just realized that I have to be very aware of the different cultures, and also I have been more curious in understanding those differences because of all those challenges that I encountered, and that maybe also many of you encountered. And those challenges include, not least, of course, the language skills. So even I myself, I have been living abroad so long and for such a long time, and I'm teaching and writing and talking in English and listening so often, and still I'm committing mistakes all the time. And and that's even more so for those who might move for the first time abroad. And I see that very often with students in my teaching, that on the one hand, if I teach Swedish students in English, they might be at their home country, but also lack maybe the perfect English skills, and then they might raise certain misconceptions or misunderstandings between them and what I'm trying to tell them. And also in writing of when supervising thesis of students from other countries, they're very often, it's the students, they are able maybe to convey their ideas in their mother tongue, or even in English in their home countries, because they're also the mis-expressions, the wrong expressions are maybe similar in English in their home country, but I make different mistakes in English than people from other countries when they talk English. And so there some misunderstandings can quite easily pop up and create difficulties and make it more challenging to be a successful teacher and supervisor. And in reverse, it can also be making it more difficult for the students to be successful or good in their courses, of course. So that is always something to bear in mind. And then also the educational backgrounds, that is something I have been, I have seen more and more over time. And I think that is also for, if some in the audience of you are still taking part in courses at the university, for example, or maybe also in extracurricular courses, we always have to bear in mind that our educational systems in different countries are quite different. And we might have same degrees on paper, but what actually brought us to those degrees, the contents of what has been taught in the courses might have been quite different. And it might have been all of good quality, but just different. And then we might miss something in the repertoire of knowledge of another person that we are teaching or supervising, or also if we are working at a company and trying to talk to team members, and then we might in the first moment when another person does not know what we are talking about, then we might be thinking that, why has this person not learned anything? But probably this person has learned quite a lot, but just very different things. And so here also patience and understanding for the different priorities that are being put and the different approaches that are being emphasized in educational backgrounds is very important to be successful or like good at working together and communicating with each other across the cultural lines. And then also the work styles are quite different between countries, and what counts as organized or independent can also have very different kinds of meanings depending on the country that we are. And as a teacher, it's quite interesting to see that also students coming from different countries being in the same course might have, some of them might need, when I'm supervising them, for example, in thesis and at the master or bachelor level, some might need a lot of input, a lot of guidance and many structural ideas, and also for themselves setting up a structure with the teacher with clear deadlines and content ideas of what needs to be delivered. And the other students might just be very used to self-organize or be independent or just do everything at the last minute. Of course, certain aspects of those are also related to personality, which is though valid probably for all the points that you see on the slide. But also very often it is culturally influenced, at least. And also again, here it is important for us as a teacher, but also for those who are students or in a team working with others from other cultures, to be aware of these differences and communicate with each other to find some common agreements on what is the best way to work on it together so that we can reach a successful outcome. And then most importantly, probably also in the part of communication, or not most importantly, but very importantly, are also meanings and interpretations. So in many countries, the meaning is very directly expressed. It's the assumption being that we don't know whether this other person has the overview of the full context. And so we better provide the entire context and don't leave anything up for interpretation. But in other countries, there might be more the routine or the procedure, the common agreement that you should not be too direct. The other person is able to know the context and to read between the lines what is said. Often this is also more helpful to not having to say something that might be hurting or sensitive or whatever. Yeah, like this might not have been, this could be implied then only indirectly. But if we then communicate with someone from such a low context, high context culture, or from a culture that is used to that everything is being said at face value, then this can create many misunderstandings. And again, also this might seem very intuitive to all of you, and also to me time and again. It sounds intuitive at the first moment, but when I find myself in a situation communicating with someone else, I tend to sometimes forget that this person has a different kind of approach to how to communicate and whether to interpret between the lines or not, whether to read between the lines or not. And then I also time and again fall into that trap and communicate in a way that might have certain things in between the lines, but this other person might not get it. And also, yeah, this is important to consider. I jumped the point on the time zone differences, which is important to consider, especially when working together with people working in other, in a project, but being placed in different countries. Also in organizing workshops or meetings like this one, which are hybrid or all fully digital, it becomes easy to forget about the need to consider time zone differences, but it's quite important to be also here polite and considerate of that there is this happening. I had actually a student who was supposed to be defending her thesis, and she was late for the thesis defense because she forgot about the time difference to Sweden. So she failed, and this is a very serious problem. So it's very important to consider, obviously, and a very illustrative example of how serious the consequences can be. And then there are the different academic conventions and expectations, which I can maybe also join together with the point on power dynamics, which means also that there are different, I see it again also especially in the teaching and supervision when it comes to the hierarchies. In certain countries, like for example also Germany, where I come from, it's quite hierarchical compared to Sweden, where there is a certain degree of authoritative distance being kept between the teacher and the student. But then coming to Sweden, it was completely different. The students, they talk to me as if I was a peer sometimes, or at least it feels like that. It's very flat. The students are also much more left on their own to work on it, but it's more on an ad hoc basis that I as a teacher jump in and provide help to them, while in a more hierarchical country like Germany, it is more like top down, that I would tell them certain tasks that they should fulfill or certain steps that they should follow in order to get to an outcome. But then if you compare, for example, Germany with Japan, where I am going to be this year, and I'm also being involved in the teaching year, it's compared to that, Germany is very flat hierarchical. So here also it's very important to consider where we come from, with whom we compare it with each other, and to keep those possibilities in mind, that it might be the cultural background that plays in creating these behaviors that we are observing, and might sometimes also at the first moment find root. And the final point, the feedback and communication styles, is something I actually had a very vivid example, or like an experience this morning, when I had a meeting with students that I'm currently supervising for the master thesis. And they just said in a very polite manner that, yes, your comments were very direct, thank you. Like they said it in another tonality, but it was quite, since I'm not sure how to read between lines in Sweden yet, which is definitely also one of my weaknesses still in communicating in Sweden. I know that a direct feedback in Sweden is not that common, and for me, it's very common to give direct feedback, and I'm already trying to make it less direct, because I have been highlighted quite often that it's too direct, which in Germany is very common. But yet it's very difficult to change the own personality that has been trained for over 30 years to give direct feedback. And so here the point is also that I want to highlight that if any one of you finds themselves in that situation and it feels uncomfortable, then sometimes it's better to just bring up that point and talk about it with the teacher, or maybe also with the student or peer or someone else, instead of just taking it personal. Or also, if the feedback is not direct, but one is used to direct feedback and finds the non-direct feedback, like one that is just very positive and maybe with hidden critique in the between the lines, but one cannot really identify it because we are not used to it. And this might also often be considered not very helpful. Then this is also very important to highlight. Just then also, after all these challenges, I want to call it, not only there are also certain opportunities in working cross-culturally, of course, like very clear ones. It's so enriching in learning cross-culturally, and it can actually be also quite a lot of fun to learn more about all those aspects that I have highlighted on the previous slide, and try to learn more about it as from the researcher's lens. There is so much research being done in social psychology and also business studies, communication, about those these pitfalls across cultures, and at the same time also how to overcome them. And so it can be quite a lot of fun to dive into that. And then also, of course, there's fewer enriching aspects than living abroad or also traveling, but I would agree with the previous speaker that living abroad is another kind of experience, and to meet others from other countries and learn about them, and maybe also take over certain features of the others. And of course, then also communicating with people from other countries, we should never be scared of the potential pitfalls that we might fall into, but instead just try to mingle with others, and thereby also improve our language skills and improve our communication skills. And also through this awareness of all those challenges that we can encounter, we can become more self-reflective, because we also observe ourselves, or can try to step outside of our bodies in some way and try to observe how do we act actually, and how much of it is our personality and how much is the culture, and how could we also adjust it to the situation and to the people with whom we are now connecting to. And and then of course we also learn a lot about different perspectives, get different insights. And as a researcher, also for myself, I find it way more interesting to do comparative research and to work with people in other countries, to not only to develop my global networks and maybe be able to do something like my stay in Japan, or travel to Portugal, or to other places for some research exchange, but also for the validity of the research. If we as researchers want to draw like valid conclusions and generalizable conclusions, then we should also look at a broader sample, or also get the insights from people from other places in the world about whether our theories also would hold in their contexts. And just to quickly conclude some lessons learned that I want to also, when preparing the presentation, I was thinking, okay, what could I communicate here also and give you as audience, as a takeaway message. Maybe that's also a German expression actually. But so I came up with those points that I think the most important point that I have concluded for myself, and is that I will probably never be perfect in cross-cultural communication, but I should definitely always be aware of those potential misperceptions between each other, and also be aware of the fact that possibly it's now right now cultural differences that are influencing the fact that I'm not a very good teacher or not successful with the student at supervising the student in the master thesis than the student itself or their capacity. As I mentioned, be curious and open-minded. That is very important. And then also we have so many prejudices in our minds about others and the other cultures and what the person coming from country A should be like. And it's time and again kind of fun to find those prejudices disconfirmed. And so we should also just give everyone the chance to disconfirm them and to also adjust our expectations. And then as more practical rules that I have established for myself also is that I more often try to ask directly instead of guessing or assuming. If I'm not sure whether a person said something between the lines and that I should have found and read through, or if I feel that I could be giving too direct feedback, then just again also ask the person whether it's too direct so I can adjust. Establish also in teaching and supervision very clear rules and routines. So also if you happen to be either supervisor in the future or teacher or want to or are coming in that role of being supervised by someone from another country, it makes sense to ask the teacher or supervisor to establish and clarify some common routines so that both sides communicate clearly with each other. And also without feeling uncomfortable with it. And seeking feedback, of course, by others and using as simple as accurate language as possible to avoid perceptions, misunderstandings. And then also sometimes maybe take a moment to reflect before answering or feeling attacked by someone else who might be saying something. And that feels uncomfortable. And then finally, of course, be patient. I think that's also be aware and patient that are key aspects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolin, for your very insightful presentation. And yeah, personally, I think I can relate a lot to what you said, specifically for the directness or indirectness way to talk to indeed your colleagues or your supervisor. As I came from a country where the communication is always quite indirect, and now I live in a country where the communication is very direct. So the first few 6 months, I thought, wow, these people are very rude. And then now I've been living there for 3.5 years, and I very see the benefit of direct communication. Avoids a lot of misunderstandings. So indeed, there's always both sides to take into consideration. But yeah, do we have any questions either from our audience here or from our audience online? I might have a question. You talked about communication styles and expectation that might be different among people that are coming from different countries. And how indeed that we could try to improve this by improving our language skills. I wanted to hear your thought about the use of AI, which is so popular at the moment, such as ChatGPT, in trying to improve the communication skills of students in their work, but also maybe more general in the academia world. And so, sum up, what's your thought about this? Like, do you agree? Do you disagree on the use of these tools?
You mean in writing then, for example, or in what settings?
In improving your language skills specifically for writing. So let's say you have to write an abstract or a thesis, or you want to improve the language of the paper that you're writing. Are you in support of the use of AI?
Yes and no, I suppose. So it depends very much on how it is being used. So I think if someone wants to improve I know that it can be quite helpful to make the text more fluent, and then it might make sense. Also, if the person then thereby learn, like if you do it, you use AI to revise an abstract or a text. And if you then also read through the improved text afterwards and thereby learn how you could write better, I think then it can be quite helpful. But if you just then copy paste the text in a document without having a look again at it, then it will not sink in. You will not gain anything yourself. And I think then it's not really a long-term helpful, then it does not really improve the communication. It just improves your grade in some way. So I think it depends also very much on how we use AI for also to improve what we have in our brains. I think there's a lot of potential to actually improve just our skills and our knowledge, but thereby we also have to be ready to commit a little to put in a bit more effort than just asking AI to solve a problem for us, but really also deal with it. And I see there also the potential with ChatGPT, since it's more like interactive. It's more like talking to someone else. So I think in that sense, it could be used in a quite useful and good way to improve the communication skills. I have not tried actually by asking about potential differences between different cultural communication styles. So maybe even there you could also in a very practical way ask ChatGPT or AI tools of another nature, whether if you are dealing with someone from, let's say, the Netherlands, to what extent they are more direct or less direct than the country you are coming from in giving feedback and how to handle such a situation. But yeah, so I think it depends very much on ourselves, how we use it, how responsibly, and also to with what end we use it.
Okay, thank you so much. We have other questions? Yes?
Thanks for a very interesting talk. You're very humble in all the ways, always talking about adapting to what students, how they perceive your feedback and so on. Don't you think, I was thinking the other way around a little bit, like you're a bridge to learn different ways of giving feedback and so on. You think you can provide Swedish students or German students with something new the other way you give feedback, or do you always think it's up to the teacher to adjust to where they come?
Yeah, I guess it's about finding a middle way together, and also some students are better at adjusting to the more direct style and others are less. And I think it also very much depends on where do we meet each other. Are the students coming, I'm coming to their country, or are they coming to my country, or are we both foreigners? And I think, and then also where do we come from each other? Like if someone is not at all used to some direct feedback, then it might be also very much hurting the other person. But I agree that I could also probably never give fully indirect feedback, because I find it just, as I have been taught like this, and I cannot adjust it in my mind in some way. I find it very ineffective and not helpful. And also, yeah. So I think there it's very much a case-to-case decision also, how much to adjust and how much try to also ask the student to be open for another style.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think due to time, we should now move to the next speakers, but feel free to connect with Carolin in case you would like to discuss this very fascinating topic. Thank you again, Carolin. So now I would like to invite our last speaker, Tad Beekman from Chicago. And in this sense, we were not super kind in terms of time difference because I think it's very early for Tad. So thank you so much for being here. Tad did his PhD in sensory and consumer science at the University of Kansas and currently is working at the newly Weds food as a sensory scientist. And today is going to give us a presentation about the impact of analytic and holistic theory on consumer and food perception. So Tad, if you want to share your screen, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Can everyone see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Awesome, then I will get started. Thank you all for having me. And it's not too early, just not quite the afternoon like it is for you guys. But I just want to briefly overview what I'm gonna talk about today. Just thank you for the introduction. So that one less thing I have to talk about. I'm gonna give a brief overview of kind of the different places I've lived, because that's seems like it's beneficial for this group just to see the different perspectives. And then I'm going to introduce just all this is going to be very high level, so not going into the nitty-gritty details or anything. I'm going to talk about what is analytic holistic thinking style, or sometimes it's referred to as cognitive style. Why can it be important to sensory? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a few specific research studies that I have worked on. So here are various places in the United States that I have lived. I do not have much experience in Europe. I've not quite gotten to go over there as much as I would like, but definitely want to in the future and see a lot of the cool places that have been talked about so far today. But for me, I was born in rural South Carolina, which is kind of, if you're not super familiar with the United States, it's more southern United States. And then I lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota, so a little bit more urban area. Memphis, Tennessee, and Cincinnati, Ohio. Those were more suburban areas, so not quite the city, more of like neighborhoods and stuff. And then moved to Detroit, Michigan. So that was a little bit more urban, but it was closer to a college campus, so that was a little different. And then I went to my undergrad at Iowa State University, which is again more rural. And during that time, I also did some studying in rural Wisconsin. So kind of some different places. And then, as was mentioned, I did my PhD in the University of Arkansas. So that was a little bit different, a different part of the United States southern region. And then currently I live in Chicago. So definitely the biggest city I've lived in so far. And just got to meet some really cool people of the different places I've lived. And the main thing I'm talking about today is pretty much summed up by this picture, is if you have two people looking at the same food item or eating the same food item or talking about the same food item, they're not going to have the same thoughts about it, and they're not going to think about it the same way. So person A is going to have different opinions and come to those opinions in a different strategy than person B does. So that's kind of the very, very large and very brief overview. And then more specifically, I am going to talk about the analytic holistic style. So that is one cognitive theory. One reason I studied this and I'm talking about this instead of some other thinking or cognitive styles that are out there is that this is a little bit more recent version, and was developed to be a little bit more applied rather than theoretical. And it was meant to be more all-encompassing rather than focus on very specific problem solving or specific behavioral instances. So just some very brief overviews and differences between the analytic and holistic styles is the analytic style is more associated with Western cultures, such as Western Europe, United Kingdom, USA, Canada. And people in this group tend to think more, focus on more singular or individual aspects, and see things and events as more independent of one another. And they also believe events happen in a predictable manner, and often this is thought of as a linear manner. So if something is happening, it's going to continue to happen. And then on the other end is the holistic group. So this is more associated with Eastern cultures. And historically, in a lot of the research, there's been a lot of research in Korea, Japan, and China. And the holistic group has been found to focus on more contextual and multiple aspects of situations. And they also see things as more connected, or events as more interconnected and not independent, so more dependent on one another. And the holistic group believes in more constant change with less predictability. So as the analytic was more linear, the holistic is more circular. So something positive happens, something negative could happen, something positive, kind of that aspect. And the arrow in between this, so the purple arrow right in the middle of the screen, is very important, because this is not a black and white, this is not a 1 and a 0, it's more of a spectrum. So this is just where these cultures tend to fall on one or the other end, but individuals can fall all in between these two areas. But the research just talked about, okay, these are the two main groups that have been found across different cultures. And just a little additional background is a really useful tool. There is the analysis holism scale that's used to classify the different cognitive styles. Higher scores are more holistic, lower scores more analytic, and it's actually a pretty powerful tool and been validated across and within many cultures. And what that means is, across cultures is, let's say you're comparing a Korean population to a German population to an American population. That would be across cultures. But an example of within cultures is maybe you're looking at 3 different subgroups within the German population. Because unfortunately or fortunately, however you agree or want to look at it, a lot of time cultures are seen on countries' boundaries. But when I say within many cultures, that usually means looking within a singular country and looking at the different tendencies there. However, the one big drawback to both the analytic holistic theory and the analysis holism scale is that there's been little to no application in sensory and consumer testing. And when looking back at this slide, if you have kind of 2 almost opposite tendencies of people, then you might end up with potentially 2 distinct results within the test if you're doing some sort of study or you're wanting to do some consumer research. If you're not aware that these 2 thinking styles could exist, then if you're having the 2 different groups respond to the same food stimuli, then you may have 2 completely different sets of results that you're not aware of in your data. And then rather than seeing those 2 results separately, the data may you may find it in between the 2 groups, which isn't representative of either group. So then we wanted to look at how do these effects apply to food and sensory testing, and really, are they important? So something I also want to show is just a recent finding that others are interested in this, and they're finding that it is applicable to some sensory and consumer work, is that there's a plate size effect in general, just how people are. With larger plates, people are going to serve themselves more food. They're going to tend to eat more food with larger plates or bowls, been fairly consistently across different studies. And then what some researchers found recently, which is going to support the research I talk about in just a minute, is that these differences plate size effect differences were found to be more associated with holistic thinking tendencies. So with a larger plate and greater holistic tendencies, there's going to be more of an effect. There's going to be more an effect of what they are eating and how much they're consuming, whereas the analytic individuals, there's going to be less impact of plate size. So that is kind of the main impact there, and it shows that what a traditional sensory effect is known, plate size effect, it could differ of what the effect is seen across these different analytical holistic cognitive groups. A couple slides the next few slides I'm going to talk about is I'm just going to very briefly overview 3 research studies that I've been involved with, and they're actually all published. So I'm doing a very brief overview. So if you want to look at more of the details and some more of the methodology and specific findings, you're more than welcome to go read any of them, or if you can't find them, just feel free to reach out to me and I can send you a PDF of it. I know different universities, different people have different access to journals, and I never want that to inhibit anyone's ability to learn more. So if you ever need or want to look at these papers, just feel free and I'm more than happy to send them to you. So the first one I'm going to talk about was the very exploratory one. So it was actually published before the paper that I just shown. But this one was me and my major advisor. We were looking at, okay, we know that this analytic holistic theory, it's very important and very consistent in the psychological and cultural psychology fields. And we think it can apply to sensory and consumer food behaviors, but we're not sure because it hasn't really been looked at before. So we wanted to conduct focus groups to see how are people that are scoring either higher, so more holistics, or lower on the AHS, more analytic, how are these differences shown within food specific settings? So what was really interesting is that there were consistent differences between groups. So the analytic and holistic did not have the same outcomes. And when we looked at the food experience, we looked at, okay, kind of beginning to end. So shopping, cooking, and eating, we kind of use those as the 3 main categories of the food experience. And it was really cool to see that a lot of the main findings we found echoed the theories that were expected based on psychological work and mostly in cultural psychology. But this is in a very specific sensory study. So the analytic group, they tend to buy individual items, so more ingredients, and then they focus on a singular food aspect, where the holistic group, when they're shopping, and what's important for them when they're shopping and buying food, is they focus on less ingredients, but making sure that they are buying cohesive meals, and then they consider multiple aspects of the food, so whether that be the brand, the cost, their previous experience, kind of all those are more interacting rather than one singular important aspect. And then when cooking, the analytic group, they're more focused on a single item or an attribute, like the dish being spicy or the dish being sweet. Whereas the holistic group, a lot of the participants talked about it being more cohesive, or one common word is harmonious. And then that's how they think about cooking a meal. And then eating, it was interesting, the analytic group, they are focused on a single food attribute. So whether that be spiciness, sweetness, protein content, vegetable content, and it was interesting, they're less affected by the food experience, meaning their surrounding environment. Whereas the holistic group, they're less focused on those singular food attributes and more on overall feeling. What was their experience? Was it good? Was it bad? How did it make them feel? And they're more influenced by the eating experience. So their eating environment, who they're with, what they are doing. So it's very cool to see these differences show up in a specific sensory and food research situation. And kind of the main takeaways here were that holistic, they focus on overall and multiple aspects of the food individuals, of the food experiences, and the analytic group, they focus on individual and singular aspects. And again, I want to just reiterate that it was kind of mentioned in the earlier presentations that these are tendencies of a group or a culture and not an individual. So one person may lean more holistic or lean more analytic, but just because that is how they're categorized or that is what they're more associated with, that doesn't mean they don't have any of the attributes of the others. So it's just kind of leaning one way or the other. And then the two other big takeaways is that food experience responses can accurately predict consumer cognitive group placement. And that means based on their responses, it was very accurate that it could almost, we could reverse the study and it could predict which cognitive group they would score into based on the AHS. And it really just drove home that the analytic holistic style variable is an important aspect to consider in future consumer research, especially in the food setting. So the next study I want to talk about is replicating the analytic holistic context effect, because in that earlier slide that I showed, it was that the analytic group is less affected by their environment because they see things as more independent. And the holistic group, they're much more focused on contextual aspects, so the context that they're eating. And it was also found in this that the holistic group is more influenced by their experience, and the analytic group is less impacted by their experience. And this has also been shown within a lot of historical research within the analytic holistic world. A lot from the cultural psychology is that they found that the holistic groups they focus on the context of an event or stimuli much more than the analytic group. So here we looked at a pad thai noodle dish. As if any of you are in university or academic research, sometimes the dish you're looking at is based on the food you have available with your funding or where your funding is coming from. So that is why the pad thai noodle dish was chosen. It was able to be made consistently and served fairly consistently across all the panelists and treatments. But here's the control treatment that we used to look at the context effect. So a very neutral setting, all white, clear plastic, whereas that we introduced an eating environment treatment. So it's almost like control versus treatment. And it had a nicer plate. It was a heavier plate, a nicer weighted fork, a heavier glass that had decoration on it, a nicer material of a napkin. So we're inducing more of an eating environment that could be representative of like an different eating experience, and seeing how the different groups were impacted. And it was very, very interesting to see that when we looked at, we subtracted the control responses from the test responses. So essentially we had a variable that measured the difference between the two treatments. And there were significant positive interactions between this difference, so a larger difference, and AHS scores. So as participants were more holistic leaning or had more holistic tendencies, they had a greater impact of the eating environment, meaning that the scores between the test and control, so that eating environment and the control, were larger. And also the holistic group had significantly greater mean values than the analytic group. So again, that test minus control value was significantly higher for the holistic group. And there's a lot more details on this in the paper, but the main takeaway is just this bottom box, is that the holistic group was more impacted by their eating environment than the analytic group. So it showed that this context effect is incredibly important in a sensory and consumer science application whenever they're whenever people are interacting with food stimuli. And it is predicted that this extends beyond food stimuli, but that's as far as we've gotten so far. And the third one I want to talk about is, I mentioned the AHS, or the Analysis Holism Scale, is a tool that has been used to measure people's analytic and holistic tendencies. However, a main drawback, and we found this throughout our studies that we conducted, is that it's very general and people have difficult time applying these very general statements to food specific situations. So like one example of the AHS is you have to state how much you agree or disagree that everything in the world is related, or nothing in the world is related. And some people have difficulty applying that when they're looking at or tasting food. So we developed a food related AHS to offer researchers a better option to assess consumer responses in food specific and sensory specific research. And here it was, there's a lot of different iterations and different pieces of the study were done. But the first main thing is a food-based version of the Analysis Holism Scale was developed to cover the experience from shopping to consuming for consumers. And that was those same categories that I mentioned earlier on the focus groups. And it was really, for me, it was very satisfying to see that the scale was successfully implemented and optimized within a food, sensory, and consumer research study, that it was being able to be utilized and then optimized through model and scale development methods. And the initial findings were very promising, that it supports a superior performance in food-specific research compared to the traditional AHS in a food-related study setting. So the findings were much closer to what was expected compared to the traditional AHS, and a lot of the results were a little bit more clear rather than muddled, and kind of especially the groups, there's a lot less variation. So the initial findings support that this food-based AHS could be a superior option when looking at a very specific food and sensory-related study. And here is just an example of the 6 questions from the shopping that I wanted to show, because I'm like, with a new scale, sometimes it's hard to talk about without showing. So like one of the questions was, promotions and coupons influence what I buy when shopping. And the participants just have to state how much they agree or disagree. Or I let my feelings decide what I will buy when I'm shopping for food, or the surrounding store environment determines what I will buy when shopping for food. So these questions are associated with more analytic or holistic groupings. And then based on how much people say they agree or disagree with these different statements can help us get an idea of what their leanings in a food situation may be, because we are finding that people's general analytic and holistic tendencies did not necessarily mirror their analytic holistic tendencies when specifically applied to food situations. And just before wrapping up, some cool future areas of investigation that I would like to look at someday, or really anyone I would encourage to look at if they're interested in this as well, is how do geographical and food cultures interact with analytic and holistic result differences? Because at the very beginning, I mentioned that culture is often associated with geopolitical boundaries. So the country's boundaries often determine cultures and how that's looked at in research. But as pretty much all of us know, food cultures can vary wildly within a country, even neighborhood to neighborhood within a country. So how do these geographical and food culture boundaries interact to show different analytic and holistic differences? And as a new scale, the food-based analysis holism scale would be really cool to fine tune it and see if it's more specific or more beneficial in different cultures and food-based scenarios. And just something interesting, being more in the industry and looking at our research and development and product development, is that there's a lot of products that are developed and then end up failing on the market, even though they offered a lot of promising consumer scores. So how do analytic and holistic differences help explain these product success or failures, and also help explain cross-cultural consumer trends? Because sometimes trends that seem really catchy in the US do not catch on in Europe or Asia Pacific, but then vice versa, some trends that we think are gonna translate very well to America do not translate well, and then that kind of can lead to some product failures. So just trying to understand a little bit of this, these differences and how analytical holistic theory could be really cool here. So I'm sure you guys have all had a long day so far. I know my day's just beginning, but I just want to thank you all. It's so fun to meet you and talk to a different group of people that I've never had the opportunity to meet or talk with before. So I just want to thank you and open up to any questions.
Thank you so much, Deb. Yes, I think we have a question.
Yeah. First, I want to thank you so much for this interesting studies and also results. I'm interested to know from which countries were your group sample in your research?
Yes. So, are you asking where the research was conducted?
You have 2 groups, right?
Yes. Yes. So the research was all conducted within the United States. But that was one of the points that I mentioned, that within cultures and between cultures, there are still these groups that exist. So they're not as strong, or they're not as widely different. But within the United States, or within Germany, or within Sweden, there's still groups of analytic individuals and groups of holistic individuals. So this all this research was planned before COVID happened. So it was supposed to start within the US and then expand to Europe and Korea. but that all kind of got put on hold and did not happen because of COVID. So we looked at the groups that we could access within the United States.
Great, thank you. I have another question.
Yes.
So for the eating environment, you only had differences between the how to say how you served the food. You didn't use any virtual reality, right? You didn't change anything of the surrounding environment.
That is correct. Yep. So the only variable we changed was the table setting, because we thought if we could start kind of on a smaller scale, that in the future it could be looked at a larger scale, so virtual reality or even an in-restaurant study. So instead of just doing in sensory testing booths, we could do in-sensory testing booths and the same food served in a restaurant, or in a sensory testing booth, but it has like they're in a virtual reality setting. So we started small to hopefully build bigger in the future.
I think we're a little bit over time, but feel free to connect with Thad and also anybody in the audience. We're going to also share we can share the contact of the speakers, of course. But thank you so much, Thad, and thank you so much, all of you, to join. Unfortunately, yes, I think there is another workshop starting soon, so we don't want to take all the time of it. If you liked the event today and you want to also be more involved in the E3S next generation working group, feel free to reach out to any of us. We will be here for the symposium and the conference tomorrow. We also will be in Pagmore, so we hope to see you there for our gathering. So thank you so much.